After I built my first frame, I was trying to decide what my next frame project should be. I knew I was going to become a dad early the following year, so I spent that summer attempting to build the ultimate dad bike. It would need to fit a full-size child seat, haul snacks and other supplies, and be able to handle the wide variety of terrain we'd be exploring. I figured I had successfully built a fat bike for my first frame, so a fat cargo bike would be an easy second frame. Or so I thought. The frame was originally based on 26-inch fat bike wheels front and back. This is a few years before Surly introduced the Big Fat Dummy, so there wasn't anything like this commercially available. But it never actually became a 26-inch fat cargo bike. This was 2012 and Surly had just released the Krampus, along with its 29 plus wheels. So with the addition of a second generation Fargo fork, the frame ended up with a 29 plus front wheel. I gave the frame enough clearance to fit a 29 plus wheel in back, but kept the 26-inch fat wheels so the rear rack would be lower. Knowing a kid would be riding on top of the rack, I wanted to keep the weight as low as possible. This obviously changed the geometry of the bike, but a slightly slacker head tube angle and higher bottom bracket weren't necessarily bad things. This was the last frame I built with my hand-me-down Craftsman torch. I upgraded to a Smith torch set after the Craftsman acetylene regulator blew a seal during this project. I didn't have much for metalworking tools at the time, mostly just a vise, drill, hacksaw, some files and tube blocks, and a very basic version of my jig. I made tweaks to my jig after most frame projects, but for this one it was pretty much the same as it was for the first frame, at least for the front triangle. The long rear end did require some temporary jig mods later on. Being the second frame, and the fact that my first frame didn't fail after a year of hard riding, I was feeling more confident in my brazing abilities. And this frame gave me plenty of extra brazing practice. The front triangle is nothing special and pretty much the same as my first frame, which was one of the biggest mistakes I made with this project. While the front triangle is pretty standard, the rear is what makes this bike interesting. The yoke was a bit different from my first frame. Frame number 1 used a single 1/4 inch strip of 4130 as the main part of the yoke. Because I had extra space in this frame, I used a thinner strip, but supported it with triangular plates on each side. This is the first frame I used low mount dropouts from Paragon Machine Works. I've used a version of these dropouts on every bike except for frame number 1 and my son's bike. I've said this in other videos, but having extra bits and pieces of 80/20 comes in really handy for making small temporary fixtures. This fixture for the chainstay assembly is a good example, as is the extension I needed for the jig for the rear triangle. For some strange reason, I designed this frame around a 100mm fat bike bottom bracket shell and a standard 135 rear hub. And the rear wasn't offset like the early Pugsleys. I already had the rear wheel from a previous bike, and as far as I can remember, I was just too cheap to rebuild the wheel. My thought was that since the chain is so long, chain line wasn't as big a concern as it would be for a normal bike. Once the main frame was complete, I built it up for a test ride. I remember thinking it felt a little long, but overall it didn't ride that much different than a normal bike. The 3-inch Nard up front and the 3.7 endomorph in back definitely made for a smooth ride. Because of the 135mm rear hub, I had to remove 2 cassette cogs so that the chain would clear the tire. I really should have built it around a 170mm hub. Losing gear options on a cargo bike isn't ideal. For most of its life, this bike had a 2x7 drivetrain. More recently, it's been a 1x7. After a couple test rides, it was time to build the rack. I purposely used the same size tubing for the rack as Yuba bikes, so it would be compatible with their cargo bags. I also wanted to handle a fair amount of weight. After the rack was done, it was time for some more test rides with the cargo bags. This also gave me some time to decide where the cable stops and guides should go. Then I went back into the park stand one last time for all the braze-ons and a mount for the kickstand. The kickstand was something I put off assuming I'd just figure it out when I got there, and it took a couple tries. I didn't want to drill a hole through the main tube between the bottom bracket shell and the yoke, and the kickstand was pretty short, so I had to make a rather large mount on the bottom of the frame. This kickstand barely cleared the tire and chain when it was folded up, and because of where the hinge mechanism was, it didn't have much ground clearance for logs or other trail obstacles. I eventually gave up on the first kickstand and bought a Plesher double kickstand. It folds up nicely out of the way and still does a decent job of keeping the bike upright when parked. This frame project had some unforeseen challenges, and of all the frames I've built, I made the most mistakes on this one. I chalk these up to poor planning, inexperience, and overconfidence. I mentioned the issues with the rear hub spacing and the kickstand, but it doesn't stop there. There's a ton of chain slap on the yoke. I should have sloped the top tube for more standover, and I definitely should have used thicker and larger diameter tubes. This bike is pretty flexy, especially with a kid on the back. The bike never felt sketchy, but you could definitely feel it flex. And here it is in its current form. The primer gray rattle can paint job got replaced with a nice green powder coat after a couple years. As my son got bigger, I replaced the child seat with some handlebars, a wood deck and pad, wheel guards, and a set of stirrups. Even with all the mistakes I made on this frame, it still rides like a bike. And it's a fun bike too. And most importantly, my son and I had a lot of good times using it to explore the local paths along the lakes, creek, and river. It's sad to say, but for the last couple of years, this bike hasn't gotten much use. My son is too big for me to haul around, and as you can see by the lack of front brake, it's started to get scavenged for parts. Someday I'll set this bike up again for regular use, and it does ride a lot better without a 60-pound kid sitting on the top of the rear rack. I like to remove the passenger cockpit, put the big Yuba bags back on, and get an e-motor kit for it. I wouldn't want to haul really heavy loads with it, but it could definitely replace my car for some errands around town. And there it is, frame number 2. It might not have turned out as good as I had hoped, but it's still a really fun bike. If you haven't watched my other videos, go check them out. There are a bunch of videos showing the frame building process for my current project, along with a couple other bike check videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons so you'll see the next video when it comes out. Thanks for watching, take care, see you next time.